Thanks very much. So this is a bit of a problem, the name of this conference, for someone who's coming from Texas. And so I've named my talk here a bit spikily, Dispatches from the Frontier, because I think the problem is you really need frontiers. And maybe what we were thinking was this should be learning without frontières. But that's different, isn't it, really? I come from a place sort of in the middle of nowhere in Texas, about 3 hours from anywhere else. It's a tragic, isolated little place, actually, but a great place, and we're doing some exciting things there. 3 years ago, we started giving iPhones and iPod Touches to all of our students to see what a truly mobile learning environment would really look like. How does it change classes when you no longer have to be meeting in a room, for example, and when you can just go anywhere, when everybody has information all the time, when they're always connected. And that's been great. It's been very exciting for us, especially coming from this weird little place. Now, this is the first map of Abilene. It was drawn actually 2 years after the town was founded by the railroads. You'll see that there's, well, not really a lot there. I mean, there's a kind of emerging downtown. There are maybe 30 businesses here in 1883. There's the railway going through the middle. They've mapped out the place. You can see this is very exciting. I mean, there are actually whole blocks where there's not a single building. But this is part of what frontiers do. And this is my favorite part of this map from 1883, those two roads would just sort of empty out onto the prairie somewhere. And the whole reason this town exists is this. Because it's connected to other places. And in fact, they're naming the Internet 2 project, right, the Abilene project, which is very exciting. It's not our Abilene, unfortunately, that's Abilene, Kansas. But still, Abilene, Texas was named after Abilene, Kansas, so maybe that all, I don't know. So we're here talking, we've heard some, I think, really compelling speeches talking about the future of education and the importance of being able to stop losing people. All these students, all these learners, all these people who could be so creative and could do so many things. And we know that the sort of wealth of our cultures is based on our ability to capture people's imagination, capture their learning, help them be connected. That, in fact, effectively, the problem is we're not reaching out to the frontiers. There are all these frontiers that have been disconnected, aren't there? And that there are so many people in these kind of little packets that are walled away, and we're not meeting their needs. We're not discovering them. We're not connecting them to the larger world. And that's really the challenge that we have. The US has tragic statistics, I have to tell you. I mean, every 26 seconds, one of our students drops out of high school. And almost a full third of our high school students won't graduate, which is tragic, really, and hard to imagine. And the top reason they say it's not boredom. Many people think it's boredom, but boredom has nothing to do with it. It's that people feel that there's no relevance, that they themselves are not relevant, that they're not connected, and that their learning isn't connected, that it doesn't make sense with any of the stuff that they do. So how do we find that relevance? Many people say what we need to do is focus on basics. And when they say that, they really typically mean we need to focus on these sorts of specialized tools that only learned people use, like this. How many of you know how to use one of these? That's brilliant these days, isn't it? And what we really need to do then, what these people say is what we really need to do is find a way to push that into the new technology. And of course, one can do that. I mean, it turns out there's a great slide rule app, if anybody's interested in it. What I want to talk about today, though, is what do we do with this technology? Because this technology, it seems to me, is increasingly problematic. It's been a great one, but in recent adventures, for example, it hasn't always worked out well to translate this into a new medium. And part of the reason for that is we tend to just sort of push these things through without really thinking about how the change is going to impact what we do, what we think about. So it turns out just digitizing a text isn't the same as creating a digital book. I mean, it's a digitized text. We have another saying out on the frontier, which is, when the only tool you have is a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. And maybe what we need to do is start finding more and different kinds of tools so that we can create a different kind of world. So let me talk about a kind of model that we've seen emerge. And I have to tell you, there's a sort of tragedy here, which is, and I know people have apologized for sort of going back into the 70s to talk about technology. I'm going to go back a little more than that. My specialty is actually medieval British literature. I focus on literature of the 14th century. And so thinking about how literacy has happened, how technologies of learning have happened in the 500 or 600 years that I'll talk about today, there's this sort of pattern that keeps repeating itself. So here's how it works out. In becoming established, an informational model will become increasingly managed, closed, monolithic. Fewer and fewer people can participate, there's more control over it, things like that. A group excluded from access will grow increasingly frustrated by that, by this model that refuses to serve its needs. And so that group will often then construct a new model, often in the cracks of the existing model, a place where nothing really exists right now. And I think we're seeing that. We've heard that a lot today in the various kinds of talks that we have. I mean, I think this brilliant example of these students in this sort of, in the housing estates here. I mean, this is a brilliant example. These are people who are finding a way to participate, even though there's no official or sanctioned way for people to participate. Now, what happens then is that welcoming in of new participants often creates this real energy, I mean, amazing energy. And that energy tends to welcome in more and more people, which means that pool starts to get bigger and bigger. There's growing vitality and flexibility. And at a certain point, that model will disrupt, will explode the old model, right? And that new group will move into power, at which point the cycle will repeat itself, right? So we have this kind of move here. We have a move from transformation, that kind of moves around from innovation to extension, to transformation, to solidification, to friction again. And I think right now we're sort of in this part. We're at this point where there are these new technologies that are extending, and we're at a time of transformation, which is a particularly scary and dicey time. And I think the difficulties we see in the current print world, for example, with current publishers is part of this really disruptive transformation. What's going to happen? Old models are collapsing. I mean, we heard that, I think, this morning with Theo Gray, right, saying, well, why would you ever buy a textbook? Well, that's a good question, maybe. Is there a reason to buy a textbook, and what is that reason? What does that reason look like? Let me tell you about one great example, I think, of this, and it's a great example of an educational community. It's an informational community, an educational community in which these things happen. I mean, it's brilliant, right? 86% of all of the communication in this community is about social knowledge construction. 58% systems-based reasoning, the use of counterarguments, the use of data or evidence, model-based reasoning. I mean, it's brilliant stuff. And the community I'm talking about is, of course, the world of Warcraft. Right? All of the communication that's happening in World of Warcraft, it's a very strange model. These are people who might not ever participate formally in a class, and yet who find themselves becoming experts, renowned experts, right? The sorts of people we heard just before lunch who are blowing up on Twitter and blowing up on YouTube because they've got all these people following them. This great study that was recently done found that 65% of all communication in World of Warcraft displayed an evaluative epistemology in which knowledge is treated as an open-ended process of evaluation and argument. I mean, isn't this exactly the sort of thing we would want for our students? Oh dear, what's happening to my video image? That's tragic, isn't it? Let's try that again. Am I lost? Switch me to 1. J'espère. Merci. Anything? I may just have to talk. This could happen. All right, well, anyway. What we have is a changing model. And it's a model that's, I'm just going to keep going, and if video comes back up, then we will discover it, yes? Hey, looky there. That's very exciting. What we have is a changing model. And part of the reason World of Warcraft is exploding so much is that it's not just a model, it's about consumption. These aren't the game's creators who are helping people understand how to play it. These are the participants. We're moving from a model of consumption to creation. And if that's what's happening in our popular culture, part of what we have to think about is, how does that happen in our literate culture? How do these people, in other words, build on a new frontier, on a new informational frontier and on a new educational frontier? How do we give them tools not to just sort of move into pre-existing houses, but to build their own and to really establish that frontier area? So what is the future of books? What does that look like? Now, I love books. This is my favorite place in the whole world. This is Duke Humphreys Library at Oxford. It's a great place if you're a medievalist. Also, if you're a Harry Potter fan, that's where they filmed some stuff. And you know, we medievalists, there's some great stuff about original books, about the first age of books. These are made by hand, right? We can tell the difference, in fact, between who made them because the handwriting is different. We learn to recognize different hands. There's great early stuff. You know, we got early versions of hypertext markup language, right? Versions of YouTube. I think this is an alpha version of YouTube. Right, where we've got media, even augmented reality, right? This is a picture of the brother of the King of France receiving the book in which this picture appears. Oh. So what does this first age of reading look like? Well, it's an interesting one. This, by the way, is St. Ambrose, who's renowned because when he reads silently to himself, the other monks say, his lips barely move. Now, we make fun of people whose lips move when they read silently, only because we're not parsing medieval Latin. Learning was understood to be a very physical thing in this period. And we had knowledge that was traditional, right, based on broad, kind of traditional authority. The textual environment was characterized by elite access to creation and elite access to consumption. Texts were very personalized. Information was very localized. The people might change, in fact, a text to reflect their local conditions, or might illustrate that text with stuff from their local community. And reading is communal. I mean, this is part of the thing. People are watching Ambrose read quietly, but in many cases, because not everybody can afford a text, these texts are actually being consumed as part of a community effort. And the learning model is creational. The idea of creating information is very important. So if I look, I break that down into sort of 4 terms, right? This is learning that's contextual, it's traditional, it's based on community, and it's customized. But the challenge of this age, the challenge of this first period, is access. Not everybody has access. In fact, very few people have access, which is why teaching got its start, right? Lecture, originally, the thing we decry, well, part of the reason we decry it is its original intention was that the reader, the lecturer, read out the book so that the students could make a copy of it, so that they'd have the book with them. It was a way of giving access to the text. And that's why when this fellow came along, people thought it was the death of education. Universities and schools fought against the printed book horrifically because they said this is going to destroy everything. What do we do now that we're letting all these great unwashed people in and they're not having to make their own books anymore? I mean, think about what his change did to the world. You know, it used to be to make one book. This was a flock of sheep or a herd of cattle, right? And huge expense. But suddenly with Gutenberg, right? I could have book after book after book come off the press, all the same, these great piles of books. We saw an explosion in the size of libraries. Libraries that had once, in the Middle Ages, maybe had just a couple of hundred books, now had thousands, tens of thousands, and ultimately millions of books. And that trend changed everything, because we no longer had books that were customized. We no longer had a participative community. Only a few people now. It was even harder, ironically. I mean, in the Middle Ages, if I at least had access to the supplies, I could make something. Now it was much more difficult to get through all the publishing and complexities of that. So we developed a hierarchical model of authority. We saw a textual environment characterized still by elite access to creation, but now for the first time by mass access to consumption, which was really cool. But reading changed. It was no longer communal because now everybody could afford to have a book. So instead of reading together and talking about that, I'd read alone. In fact, that's the whole point of reading, right? To find a quiet corner alone where you can go. And so we saw then a standardization of texts. We saw information generalizing, and we saw this competition model of information emerge. And so the sort of 4 terms I'd say here, this is about generalized information, it's about competition, It's about isolation. It's about standardization. Now, that model, that first printing press gave us some amazing things. It transformed the world. It gave us revolutions in 3 specific areas. And in education, it's the thing that gave us universal education for the first time. We couldn't have universal education without the printed book. But it created a significant problem. This. Where was that one piece of, how do I, right? The challenge of this age, the second age, the print age of information, is finding stuff. I've now got 10,000 books. Where do I find that piece of information? It's really complex. So we have to invent new technologies to help us discover, right? So we invent this. How many of you remember this thing? When's the last time you got to use one of these? It's hard to say, right? I mean, there are still some around, some great institutions, but by and large, we've moved them to this. Except this isn't really the model we're working on anymore. I mean, I remember when we first got our digital library catalog, and, you know, wow, it was amazing, but it wasn't like this. So let's do a search on this. Let's search for, I don't know, educational technology. Let's see what happens there. We do that search, and okay, look at those numbers. 64.8 million hits in 0.2 seconds. Do you realize, just take a few seconds to think about this. In fact, take 10 seconds to look at each one of those pages. Do that as your full-time job. 5 days a week, 40 hours a week, 8 hours a day. Do that, and you will complete processing this search, spending 10 seconds on each of those pages, in only 86 years, 6 months, and 28 days. Right? That's easy. In the digital age, the problem is information is now a commodity. Information's everywhere. I think we saw this illustrated really well this morning when we could all answer the questions about, you know, those people, those first questions that were up about recognizing things. That's easy. We can look stuff up. But the problem now is we live in this information matrix. There's stuff all over the place, right? And that informational challenge means that the problem today is we have to figure out how to assess information. Right? There's so much of it. I don't know which of those Google hits are good, which ones aren't, which ones have been superseded, which ones are just made up. How do I assess the stuff that's around me? And this is a problem that's about to get a lot worse. In 2020, according to the American Library Association, information on the internet will be doubling every 15 minutes if trends continue. Right? So you go into a standard 1-hour class, get out, there's 16 times more information than when you went in. In a 3-hour class, a 3-hour graduate seminar, go in, when you get out, there's 4,096 times more stuff than when you went into that class. Right now already, I mean, there was a prediction that by 2008, information would be, in the sciences, would be doubling every 2 years. This year, it's doubling every 72 hours. So how do you teach people about this stuff? Does a printed book that's static survive in this kind of world? So what does digital reading look like? Well, I think we're going to see some changes, and I think we've already heard about those today. Part of it is authority changes dramatically. This is social authority. It's based on connectedness. I think we, for the first time in history, are seeing mass access to creation and mass access to consumption. And we're again returning to this idea of communal reading. In ways, there are companies now, for example, that are letting people watch one another read and mark up a text. We're using some of those at my school. It's brilliant stuff. And we're again personalizing texts. Texts are sort of mixes, right? It's like my music mix. I can pull in a chapter or a piece or a chunk from here and there and remix books. So I think we're going to see this move to collaboration, again, bringing back a lot of the stuff we actually had in that first period, that first age of information, but now accessible finally to the great masses. And that's because this world is the world we now live in. And in a world that's going to limit publishing to just a few publishers, it's going to be overwhelmed by this. This is what's emerging in the cracks of that world. These are people who are used to participating, right, in determining when and where and how they get information and how they share that information. And the problem with the printed book right now is, where do I plug it in? Right? How do I get it in that mix of stuff? So the future of books, really quickly. I think part of what we want to see here is books, first of all, books have to become social. They have to be places where I can participate with my community of people, which means when I'm writing in the margin, why is that not a space where we can all read one another's comments, or where I can actually communicate with the author himself or herself? I want to customize books. I want books that let me get to what I want to get to and mix the way I want to do it. Boy, I really love the images from that book, and I really like the text from that book, and I really like the helps from that book, and I'm going to make my mix. I want books that are augmented, that know where I'm standing, and that feed me specialized information based on where I am. Right? Books that, I'm reading Bronte, and I don't know what's a Lee or a Heath. I don't know what that is. Well, there's one right down the road. Let's go see it. I want books that are collaborative, that allow me to add my contribution, especially my quality contribution, to that source. Books that are interactive, that let me change things in them and see what happens. Because the model is very important, and as I change things in the book, I can see how the models work. Since the information is changing so rapidly, I can't just memorize the facts. What I need to focus on is the models. Books that are media-rich, that show me all the kinds of things I need to see. Books that are mobile, that I can carry around with me anywhere I am, so that when a moment of insight strikes me, I can do it. I can find the stuff. And finally, books that are portable, which is different than mobile. I want a book that knows I was reading it on this device, and then I read it on another device, and then another device, and it keeps track of where I am at all times. This idea, this future of books is really important, and it means that the teaching that we're going to do is going to have to change as well. The purpose for teaching can no longer be information delivery. It has to be information curation. We're helping people learn how to manage information, and that's critical. And the reason I'm talking to you about all this is, we've learned about the power of communities today. You're the people who have to leverage the publishers and the creators to make this world. This is a hugely exciting time. It's a time of great uproar. But it's also a time when I think we're going to see a completely new model of learning emerge. And since that first change, the change with Gutenberg, produced an amazing new world, I think we have another amazing new world to see. Thanks very much.
Just before I get some questions for Bill, is my next speaker, Abdul, in the house?
He's over there.
He's here. Great, excellent, good man. Right, okay, that was another great recovery. I was never going to recover from a missing third speaker. Let's go to the questions then. I'm going to try and get a sense of fairness here and look at the segments where we haven't had questions before. Let's start with this one. Any questions for Bill here? One right at the back in the middle. Can we get the mic there?
Hi, John Tarrant from Jersey. I'm very interested in the e-books thing and the digitized books and the digital books. There's a survey just been published. I admit it's from a biased organisation. The Book Industry Study Group's just come out. They surveyed university students in the UK and found 75% prefer printed books because although they're more expensive, although they're less interactive, they're used to the format, they like the fact they can sell them on at the end of it, they like the permanence of the information. And I think the permanence is a particularly important aspect. When you're talking about information exploding like this, people want to know what is the good information, and
yes,
often good information is made permanent in books. Do you have a comment on that?
I do. I have several comments on that, actually. I do think people want permanence, and they want to be able to go back and find that thing again, which means somehow we've got to build versioning into these new books in ways that are unbelievable, because as information changes, as new versions emerge, I want to be able to see the version I was looking at. So I think that's critical. But I would say in terms of, we've done research at our own university as well, and I think part of the problem is, and we saw that, I think, in the Princeton study that I showed, where they said, look, this just isn't as easy to use as a real book. When digital books become as easy to use as real books, and when we can begin to see the advantages, I think people will start to say, that's what I want. At our school, we found that if students had half of their books in digital format, then they said that's what they wanted. The other problem is, it's a sort of famous quote from Henry Ford, who said, if I asked my customers what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. And I think part of the difficulty is it's really hard for people to imagine what this new world will look like. It's part of the reason I think that a group like this has to participate, because we become the sort of visionaries who help people see what's next. And so I think that's going to be a critical change as well. I don't see you know, I want to agree in some ways with Theo Gray, although I might modify his position a bit. I don't see the printed book being able to survive, the printed textbook. I think print books will always remain. I agree entirely. The aesthetic experience of a printed book, the idea of it as an object is critical. But I think digital textbooks are a must. And the reason for that is because of the pace of informational change. We've just got to find a way to help students understand and manage that. And I think that can only be done digitally.
Another question here.
Yeah, hi Bill. Yep, just wondering if you've got any examples of maybe early stages of these new sort of what you'd put into the future books category.
You know, there are a couple of models that I think are really interesting. There's a German company from Leipzig called Paper C. Paper C is giving away, it has, I think, 60,000 books. No, I've lied to you, that's a different company. It has 8,000 books digitized right now. They're giving them all away for free. They've got 60 publishers. And then if you want to do stuff with that, like let's say you want to print that book, then you pay, I think, 2 euro cents a page to print. And there are sort of micro payments. Or you have the book for 3 months till the end of the course, and if you want to keep the book beyond the course, then it expires and you can buy it. So it's a way for people to make money, but also to make the information free. I think that's really interesting. There's an American company called Inkling that's doing some really interesting stuff, and we use them actually at our school. It's the case I referred to. So in the margins of that book, you can make notes, you know, take notes in the margin, but people can subscribe to one another's margins. So we had a case, for example, where a teacher subscribed to his whole class's margins, and they subscribed to his, and he watched them read the book and realized he had no idea what he was doing in class. Because what he thought in years past they had gotten, and of course everybody would understand that, he realized as he was watching them read that they didn't get. And stuff he thought they were having a terrible time with, he watched them get it. And so he realized this was a transformational moment. And I think that kind of community factor, and there's also great media in these books as well. And so I think there's some really interesting emerging companies that are doing some cool stuff.